We are for the Osai workshop, One Heart for Mental Health. And we're gathering together as a media community, TV, television, internet. All these things have a strong role in terms of how it affects our mental health and well-being. And we can play an active participation in constructing how we are seen in the world and how we have our mental health be affected or not, and bring awareness to that. And as our leading speaker for this day, we have Tim Reid, and I will go ahead and read his bio to everyone to give a little bit of context to his work. Though at times he's a groundbreaking, if unsung, stand-up comedian, a one-man production company, Tim Reid has forever married in the minds of television viewers as and remembered as the smooth DJ Venus Flytrap on WKRP in Cincinnati, which was a TV show that ran from the late 70s to the early 80s. He was very strongly known in the US film television series. I personally remember him from my childhood on Sister, Sister, never knew how much you missed her. He came to the role, this Venus Flytrap role, in his early career, playing up as his comedy of acting in nightclubs across the country and a bit of various TV variety shows. The WKRP gave him that break he needed, and then he ran with it. This man has done so much. He's dedicated his life to producing quality programs for and about African Americans. And he went on to star and produce an acclaimed comedy series, Frank's Place, which was played on CBS from 87 to 88, and Link's Showtime show, which was 1998. He's directed at several independent feature films, most notably the gripping historical drama Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored in 1995. He's dedicated to mature, intelligent fare, as well as his easygoing comic talents made him both a favorite and a figure of distinction in the entertainment industry. We're incredibly honored to have him here with us. He knows the industry from this really important prime time of American film and TV, which influenced global politics as US was dominating a lot when it came to media at that time. And he's come to us today in 2022 with great knowledge in that area. So Tim, thank you for being here. You originally earned your bachelor's of business admin, and we know that you broke into the media industry a little bit through those early roles, but can you tell us a little bit more of how you came to it? How has entertainment become a deep interest of you? Were there any specific members or personal friends, family members, professional people that influenced you?
Well, my early life influenced me in gripping ways. I was uh, reared in very difficult circumstances in America at that time. I was born and raised in Norfolk, Virginia, in segregation, and stayed that way till I actually entered college in the early '60s. I had no social contact with white America at all. I had never even spoke socially to white people until the civil rights movement began. Um, it was a very difficult life, but early in life, I was chosen by my grandmother, really, who raised me to be the storyteller. And it was her insistence that I would come back from wherever I was at school or choir rehearsal and church, and I would have to literally tell her what happened that evening. And of course, she was a wonderful, wonderful audience for me, and really kept increasing me to tell stories. Just kept saying, keep telling stories. Just tell that one where. And she would always, when their friends were over, my grandmother had a boarding house and sold whiskey illegally and ran the numbers, which were illegal back then. And now we call it the lottery. But and so whenever there was always a group of people in the house, strangers or whatever, and she would always bring me in to tell them that story about the time and whatever it was. So I was reared to be a storyteller. I didn't really understand it as much, but I knew that that's what I was strong at in terms of emotion and passion to tell stories. But I didn't go in that way. I went in the business world and became graduated from college, became the first Black hired by EI DuPont in its management program. And that's where I thought I was going to be. in a big corporation, one of the first blacks hired in management. And they sent me to Chicago. Strangely enough, they said they wanted to send me to Los Angeles, but they decided somewhere in a meeting, they said, well, we send them to Los Angeles, they'll probably go into show business. Let's send them to Chicago. So they sent me to Chicago, and sure enough, I went into show business. But it was always something that drew me towards any way to perform, to tell stories. And while I was working for DuPont at that time, covering 3 states for them, I met a young gentleman, an Italian guy, at a JC meeting, Junior Chamber of Commerce. So when people ask me how to get in show business, I say, join the JCs, But anyway, and we had a kinship. He was my first white friend. I'd never had a friend, and he had come from very difficult beginnings. So he and I decided to work with some young students to talk about the ills of drug abuse and things like that. And we used to use a little humor. And one day a student said, you guys are funny, you ought to become a comedy team. And lo and behold, in a bar, we had a couple of drinks. Said, you want to try it? And I said, yes, let's try it. And that was in '69. And I've been in show business ever since. We started that and stayed together for about 5 years. We were America's first and only consistent black and white comedy team. We created a lot of trouble. There's a book written about some of the incredible difficulties and interesting times we had together as a team. But we split up, and I moved to Hollywood and began to act. And from there, one thing led to another.
That's incredible. Thanks for sharing that story. And what stands out to me are 2 things, right? That your grandmother was such an important role, and that connects us intergenerationally from the past to the future, and how each of us play that role to one generation to the next. And then the second one was that you and Tom on your comedy campaign, the desire of your duo started, and it was ignited about the well-being for your communities, anti-drugs, right? And
Yeah.
so closely linked to mental health, as we know. And so I'd like to just bring it to this conference that we're having here. And since we're here about talking about amplifying a positive message for mental health and access to information on it, can you talk a little bit about how you see the role of media, and how does it play in mental health, and how can the industry be mindful without taking away freedom of expression, of how to advocate for mental health within its community and its responsibility to the greater community, the intergenerationally?
Well, the mental health, from what I learned growing up in the South in segregation, one of the most sustainable ways to keep a balanced mental view of oneself and one's community is through your culture. And I was fortunate enough, in spite of the difficulties racially, that I knew I was loved. I knew I was part of a culture. It was a rich culture. Although I never saw it on television or heard it on the radios, other than Amos and Andy, which were 2 white guys in blackface. Our culture was a strong infusion of how we felt about ourselves. I literally had no sense of victimization, in spite of, because it was explained to me by the elders and by the people in my community how we have survived, and the greatness of the people around me. I mean, my uncles and all the people in my neighborhood, they were doers. They were people who had survived World War I, the first pandemic. They had survived the Depression when everything else was going to hell in the handbag. They survived, and that survival, they were and still considered the greatest generation to ever in modern era. Those people, they're the ones who raised me. They fought 2 wars and a conflict. They went through the Depression, the fall of Wall Street. I mean, and all of them, black and white, were able to survive and build the infrastructure that we now use today, from the system to telephone poles to universities. They built it, and those are the people who raised me. And what has happened, and I think why a lot of our mental illnesses have surfaced in such large numbers, is that when you deconstruct a culture, when you kill the traditions in which passed down, the folklore, the spiritualism of a tribal sense of essence, a young person coming of age, the things that they would have to go through no matter where they are. When you deconstruct those and you then change the view of the culture, you begin to claw away at the mental base that someone needs. I mean, in spite of the poverty that I grew up in spite of the being a bastard child, not knowing who his father was till I was 9 or so, there were men around me who had a certain symbolism about them, a certain tradition that I saw strength. I didn't see weakness. I saw fighters. I didn't see victims. I saw people who made it work, who did what they had to do. It wasn't, it wasn't Ozzie and Harriet. It wasn't what we were seeing on television. I had no idea what that world was like and was not even interested in it because it was about survival. It was about providing for one's community. They built their colleges, they built their hospitals, and they were all around newspapers. There were about 1,200 newspapers in the Black community in America at that time that told the story of themselves. And you could, when someone got married or when someone was, I remember seeing the first time my name in print was in the local Black newspaper. The first time I was in a magazine was Jet Magazine by Mr. Johnson out of Ebony magazine. So those structural things were important to us. And then around the 50s and 60s, some smart industrialists decided that it would be best to have more control and build industries that really would take away. It's like the GI Bill when all of the warriors came back from World War II. Hundreds of thousands of Black men and women who had served. They wanted part of the GI Bill, but they didn't get it. They built Levittown for the young white soldiers, but in our communities, they built the projects, which, by the way, you couldn't own. So you lose your wealth. You lose a sense of how to build wealth, family wealth. And then they had this craziness. I mean, it was almost like you couldn't plan a more deconstructed way of affecting someone's culture as well as they did it. I mean, they even gave it to the point where if you had an extra child, you get $50 more a month. And the man who gave the child couldn't live in the house with you. You couldn't go to college. You could go to beauty school or take a craft, but you couldn't go. If you did, they would put you out of the project. So that mentality, there was no welfare for Black people at that time. That's a later event. So it really deconstructed the culture and the tradition. And I think it began to claw at the mindset, and victimization became a product of entertainment. Victimization in movies. There's a whole era of movies, they were called race movies, that were created by Black filmmakers, Spencer Williams, Oscar Micheaux, Noble Johnson. They built studios. They made films to show the culture in the way that they knew it, which countered the culture that the white filmmakers were making about us. They kept us in the slave. They kept us in Birth of a Nation, the angry Black, only good for working and dancing. And so they tried to do that and was very successful until about the mid-50s. And then it went away. And when it came back, it was very much stereotypical of the modern era. So they began to deconstruct how we felt about ourselves. When you do that to someone, you begin to chip away at their mental structure, their strength. And I think a lot of that in the Black community, both here and on the continent. When you look at the continent, you look at what's happening, all the wealth, all of the great resources, how come they are not being mined and shipped by people who are there, who till the soil? It's that whole sense of how things have to work, and we're not a part of that in the media. So I think now we have to look at this media because it's Pandora's box. It's not going to go away. You can either continue to be conditioned, or you have to take charge of your story and begin to condition yourselves and your family and your people around you in a way that's going to sustain the traditions, sustain the culture. And that's what I'm about. That's what I want to see happen. That's what I try to do with the product. And anytime I have any sense of control over the media, I try to assert that.
Mm-hmm. And we're moving in such a powerful time. In a way, you could say that that generation that you were part of in the beginning, before media became so centralized and monetized, as it were, central monetization and control, and people in power who controlled it. There was, as you say, a rich discourse of small media makers telling their own stories in their own communities. And with the way internet has gone, on the positive side of the double-edged sword, as it were, we have this opportunity now to claim back our local stories, our small, our own power of communicating what matters to us. Can you talk a little bit more about the state of this media industry, its evolution, and also your role as a leader in your industry? I mean, I looked back at your bio. It Between 97 and 2014, at that point, you built one of the largest independent film studios outside of Hollywood.
Yeah.
And it also, at the time of construction, was the only Black-owned studio in the USA since the 30s.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah, so that's remarkable in and of itself.
and a bit stupid, I may add.
Uh, yeah, stupidness and greatness go hand in hand sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and now you're building a television network. So I'd
Hmm.
like you to talk a little bit about this vision of LGCY TV, or maybe it's pronounced Legacy TV.
Well, legacy of a people. I broke it. The young folks, I said, make it young, make it for the young people. They came up with LGCY TV. I said, all right, I'll go with it. But it's legacy of a people
Yeah.
network. When I started in show business, and let's say in television was 75, when I first was on a television show. If you look back at the context of television, there were about 50 companies or so that control 80 to 90% of all media. That's music, television, radio, however media was, newspapers, magazines. There are about 50 companies. And less than 10 years, that was down to about 20 something. Going into the 80s, about 12. Then you get to the 90s, even 6 or 7 companies with heads of companies controlled 70 to 80% what we see around the world. Now it's less than 3 or 4. And that is including the internet, all media. When you look at the power brokers, Elon Musk or whoever it is, and you look at the breadth of their control on media, it's nothing that's going to change, but it is a power that has to be reckoned with. How do you compete? How do you get your story, your cultural significance out in front of people? How does Africa tell its story? The greatness of its story? Do we rely on the people who are making the movies? The one that's out now, Wakanda. When I first saw Wakanda, it was a wonderful movie and it was very uplifting, and it really helped us mentally in terms of, hey, we have greatness in us. But I kept saying, there's a real Wakanda. It's called Ethiopia. It's the only country that I know of in history that from antiquities until today, it's never been ruled by a white person. It's never been defeated by colonials. It fought 2 wars against Italy. That was Wakanda. I mean, it has rich history. And you look at other countries in Africa way before colonialization, those stories never get told. And why are they important? Well, they're important for young people who are going to rebuild this world as it has happened through generations in modern era. From somebody has to rebuild and fix some of the mistakes that us older folks make. how are they going to, what are their base? What are they building it for? What are they going to use? If it's going to be the media, then they've got to know that they can control the media from ownership. And the reason I built the studio back in the day, and I was first stupid to take my money, all the money I made, and put it in the studio. It cost quite a few $1 million, but we built it, had a few angel investors. But 51 cents of every dollar came out of my pocket. I had no idea that the repercussions were going to be as strong as they were. It wasn't just about race. It was the first studio since Oscar Michaud, but it was about power. And I misjudged that. I didn't realize that it wasn't that I was any threat to show business. That wasn't it. It was just the mental state that if he does it, then others are going to do it. And sure enough, others have done it. Tyler Perry took what I had hoped to do. He used to hang out in my studio. Tyler Perry used to come visit my studio back in the day. Others did do it. So it's the thought and control of one's culture that's frightening to people who control the power of brokers. So I decided that if I made that plunge and I understand that there is power in that, how can I control my story? How can I add to the well-being of our culture and the traditions of our culture, no matter where they come from? And that is to control your distribution, control your platform. And that's what I'm hoping to do now, is to create an international platform. That I was just in the Caribbean, and I was speaking to some folks down there. And one of the things that I said, and I saw the eyes of some of the politicians there light up. I said, do you realize that the Caribbean was the new world? I said, it wasn't America. America didn't even work from the beginning in the 1492 or whatever it was. It didn't work. The first Jamestown settlement starved to death. As a matter of fact, we celebrate Thanksgiving because the colonials couldn't survive up there, and the Indians brought them food, or they would have starved to death. So America was not that profitable a venture back then. There was no great cotton, or there was no great sugar cane coming from America at that time. It was all coming from the New World, which was the Caribbean, these islands, Haiti, and all these islands, the Hispaniola, all those places created and saved the old world. The old world was just emerging from the dark ages, and the wealth that brought the old world back to its glory came from the New World, which were the Caribbean islands, all the way to Barbados, to Trinidad, all these islands. But they don't get any credit for that. When you think about stories of them, you're always talking about them as slaves and the victimization of Africans. But what they don't talk about is the wealth that was created off of their abilities to survive incredible conditions and create the kind of wealth that saved the old world. These stories need to be told. And it's not about one being greater than the other. It's about giving young people a sense of themselves that doesn't really get out much. It doesn't really come through. In other words, I think it's time for, and can help the world, if the world is beginning to be seen more and more through Black eyes. And this is not a racial thing. This is not attacking. This is just giving a view of the world through our eyes. How we see not just Black life, white life, business, just to see it through our eyes for a while. Not that it's going to all be correct and it's not going to create problems, but we've seen it through the same set of eyes most of the modern era. And if it worked, we wouldn't be having the problems that we're having. If it was the savior of mankind, we wouldn't be looking at our oceans and our weathers and the starvation that we see throughout the world, the wars. So it needs a rebirth. It needs to be reconditioned. And hopefully more of us will have a hand in that than had before. And I see change, and I'm happy to see it. And I just want to be a part of that change. The legacy of my people, the legacy of the story that I know is important. People should know. When I was told by William Paley what he said, and he asked me what was my propaganda, I told him, I said, Mr. Paley, I've watched television all my life, and I've really never seen anybody in my neighborhood on any program. I want you to know my aunt. I want you to know the people that I grew up, that nurtured me, that took care of me. They're interesting people. They're not just singers and dancers. They're interesting people. They're scholars. The guy who runs the newspaper, the photographer on the corner who just about photographed everybody in the community behind these great backdrops. And I said, these are interesting people, and they tell wonderful stories.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know them so
Mm-hmm.
that you know more about who we are as a people. Because white America didn't know anything until Roots. Nobody knew anything about Black America other than what it wasn't in the history books. You know, we heard of George Washington Carver, Joe Louis, but you never knew about any of these other people.
Yeah.
It's
And
time
it
for
was
them to come
such
on.
a loss. It's such a loss because we are a people together.
Yeah, yeah,
And if we're missing a story that is part of all of our stories,
yeah.
it brings great sadness. And the reality has become sad, right?
Well, you know, it's also, again, it goes back to the mental state. When you give value to someone else's mental strength,
Mm-hmm.
you respect them. When you don't give value to them, they are beneath you. They can be overlooked. They can be pushed aside. But when you value the contributions of someone, you respect them a little more, you know, and it's not all about fear. It's about respect. And in order to know that, I mean, one thing about the internet is it gobbles up everything. I mean, and it's so superficial because you don't go deep. If I were going to do a documentary about someone, I would do research, get archival footage, and I would put together a 30-minute or an hour program that I spent maybe months or years working on. Well, now you can just go on the internet, go on the internet and Google it and go to Wikipedia, and suddenly you are now showing on Instagram or TikTok this story about Dumas, who wrote Three Musketeers. They're just discovering that he was Black. I mean, it's so these things that I was telling my granddaughter just today, who's taking a Black history course at college. And I said, I forgot what we were talking about. And I said, do you know the name of the first slave ship? She looked at me, she said, what do you mean? I said, do you know the name of the first slave ship? She said, no, what was it? I said, it was called Jesus. And she was like, what? I said, yes. The first slave ship to leave the continent of Africa to bring us over was called Jesus. So the psychology of that for her really disturbed her, but it made her go and do research. And not only about the ship, but how the ship was built and the people who put it on. The whole idea of baptizing and making a slave a Christian because you get double the money for him or her. Those things then affect how people think about the system and about themselves. But that information has to be formed in a way that it comes at you as something useful information, not just trivia. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so those are the things that people who have control of media have to be more responsible to. You know, it can be fun and entertaining, but there has to be some responsibility to the facts, to the tradition
Mm-hmm.
of culture. It's
Mm-hmm.
irony. Irony is the best part of storytelling. You
No,
know,
it's
I use it
deep.
every chance I get.
Yeah, you've got that in your blood.
Yeah, yeah.
So tell me, uh, what can you share with aspiring or current directors, producers, actors, supporting cast members, both in Angola and the USA, and anyone else in the world that's listening to this,
Mhm.
on how you manage the creative process from concept to production, post-production, whether for documentaries, TV shows, film. And do you have any preference with respect to documentary, the TV show or film, and why? And can you talk a little bit about what can you leave to those who are in the room here, and some tools for them?
We're doing a program now. We've got 2 episodes of it. Hopefully, it'll go further, and I can broaden it internationally. And the program is called The Courage to Create, and I interview artists, sculptors, photographers, painters, singers. I'm going to interview all of them. And the idea is, it takes courage to be creative. It really does, because you have to expose a sense of yourself that we normally don't want to take chances at, and you will not always win. You will fail. I mean, my studio cost me millions, but it didn't work. But I'm still in the game. And the content that I created owning that studio is what I'm using. It's evergreen. A good story is evergreen. uh, Cain and Abel is a story that will always be retold in any form at any time. Good stories are very useful to tradition through mental wellness or to control the mental wellness of others. So a storyteller must first be passionate about the stories they want to tell. They have to really get into the history, know more about the story, and find the irony in the story. There's always an irony. Whenever I do interviews of people, like if I'm doing interviews I did quite a few interviews with World War II veterans, most of whom are all passed now. And after the interview, I would not let them leave. I said, wait a minute. So now after the war was over, what did you do? And they tell some of the most incredible stories about themselves and their life and what they went on after this incident, coming back from war. We know about all those, but the life after these things are sometimes more exciting than others. And so a writer has to go deeper than most. I was doing a documentary on university here, Black University, Virginia State University, and it goes way back to the Civil War. And how it was formed is unbelievable. It was the first and only historically Black college ever built in a white neighborhood. And it was done so out of vengeance. They wanted to get back at some people. They built it in this community to really make the people. So it's just an interesting story. And out of this, the first multiracial political party ever in American history was formed. It was called the Readjusters in Virginia, doing Reconstruction, a white-Black political party. New York Times talks about it. And it changed the face of history in Virginia. Who got elected, all of that, for 11 years of Reconstruction, a period of Reconstruction. One of the most fascinating. So many of the laws that we deal with now were created during Reconstruction. Terms, carpetbaggers, all these things come out of that. So if you're going to be a storyteller, I don't care the medium, whether it's a documentary, whether it's a short film, whether it's a feature film or television series, you owe it to yourselves, to the tradition, to go deeper, to find those little nuances that make the characters rich, not just saying funny things, even in humor. The funniest stories sometimes come out of pain. You got to go beyond the surface. You got to get deeper if you want to affect people, if you want to build an audience of people who follow your work. Look at the people that are being followed now. We can see in the music world what happened. I mean, the music world now, some of the best music in the world is coming out of Africa. The blends of music. America has forgotten the key. I mean, America's music now is nowhere near as progressive, as creative as music coming out of Africa. And so everything has its chance and its place. And our job creatively is to make our mark, to be bold, to tell the stories. As Harry Belafonte used to say, the job of an actor is make the comfortable uncomfortable and the uncomfortable comfortable. That takes courage.
Yeah. And with that, we thank you so much for your time with us and for sharing some of your wisdoms. I wish we had days to continue the conversation. And I thank you deeply.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Kim. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
All right. And goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Excellent
Goodbye.
job. You guys have a good
Thank
one.
you so much.
Goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Get that vote out.
Oh, yeah, I got to run now.
It's 11:13. I got you 2 minutes in. All right.